Right, good morning, Unite. I hope you're all doing well. So what we're going to do for your first lesson this week is we're going to look at something called the Battle of the Bulge, which is another key battle during the Second World War. However, before we do that, I'd first like to write the numbers 1 to 7 down the side of your page. And what we're going to do, like normal, is we're going to do a true or false recap quiz, just to refresh his memories on what we've been studying since September. So now you've got the numbers 1 to 7 down the side of your page. All you need to do is write the answer true or false for each one. So the first statement reads, at the start of World War I, the Russians mobilised their military much quicker than the Germans expected. Number 2, trench fever was a disease that could be caught when fighting in World War I trenches. Number 3, the tank was first used during the Battle of Arras. Number 4, the Abyssinian crisis of 1935 involved a Japanese invasion of China. Number 5, the leader of the British fascists was called Oswald Mosley. Number 6, sorry, just ignore that. Another name for the cap putsch is the Knight of the Long Knives. And number 7, Lord Halifax was a strong supporter of Winston Churchill. So if we move on to the answers, we can see that number 1, at the start of World War I, the Russians mobilised their military much quicker than the Germans expected. That is true. The Germans believed it would take the Russians around 6 weeks to mobilise their army, when in fact it actually only took 10 days, which meant that Germany, remember in World War I, had to split its army in half, so it was fighting on two fronts, the Western Front against the British and the French, and the Eastern Front against the Russians. And that's why the Schlieffen Plan failed. Number 2, trench fever was a disease that could be caught when fighting in World War I trenches. That is also true. Remember, the conditions of the trenches was horrible. You were outside for long periods of time. You had to face the weather and the rats and the disease and things like that. So trench fever did develop among soldiers. Number 3, the tank was first used during the Battle of Arras. That is false. The tank was first used during the Battle of the Somme, even though it wasn't as effective as they originally liked. Number 4, the Abyssinian crisis of 1935 involved a Japanese invasion of China. That is also false. The Abyssinian crisis involved Italy invading a place called Abyssinia, which is now known as Ethiopia. The Japanese invasion of China, on the other hand, is known as the Manchurian crisis. Number 5, the leader of the British fascists was called Oswald Mosley. That is true. Number 6, another name for the cap putsch is the Knight of the Long Knives. That is false. If you remember back to when we're looking at Hitler's rise to power, the Knight of the Long Knives is the event where Hitler decides to kill anyone in Germany who's opposed him. So, for example, the leader of the SA, any journalist that's ever questioned him. The cap putsch, however, is a different event. It is much earlier. It is when the Freikorps try to take over Germany after stopping the Spartacist uprising. Number 7, Lord Halifax was a strong supporter of Winston Churchill. That is false. Although Halifax and Churchill did work together, they were not friends. Halifax was Foreign Secretary for Winston Churchill, but if you remember, Halifax wanted to support appeasement and Neville Chamberlain, whereas Winston Churchill was all about carrying on fighting. So today we are going to look at something called the Battle of the Bulge, and our keywords for today are bombardment, which we have used before, particularly during World War I and when we looked at the Battle of the Somme. which is a continuous attack with bombs, shells, or missiles fired on a certain area. We've got offensive, which is a sort of military. It's when a side in an army or a side in a war attacks something, that is called an offensive. And we also have a counter-offensive, which is not a defence, it is where the side they are attacking then decides to attack back. So rather than defending one area, they are leaving one area to attack another area. Now, as we know, the Second World War has developed quite a lot throughout the events we've been looking at. So D-Day and the invasion at Normandy in the north of France opened up a new front in the Second World War. Like the First World War, it split Germany's army in two. They had to fight the Russians on the Eastern Front, and they had to fight the Allies, the Americans and the British, and what was left of the French on the Western Front. Like I said there, and it was basically, it led to something that Hitler wanted to avoid. So in World War One, they wanted to avoid fighting on two fronts because it would weaken both sides of their army. And in World War Two, they thought they could avoid that again and learn from the mistakes. However, it ended up happening again. So the phrase "history's repeating itself" is sort of, echoed here. Now, it worried Hitler because it was looking very similar to World War One. And at all costs, Hitler tried to avoid it. Another what's called a self-destructive stalemate, a side where no side can really win. So Hitler goes up with a very bold and quite dangerous plan to try and change things. I do apologise for that noise, by the way. That's just Mr. Fisher messaging me about schoolwork. So, why should Hitler and the Germans attack in the Battle of the Bulge? So, following the success of the invasion of Normandy, the Allies quickly began to advance through France. They were taking a lot of area that the Nazis had won at the start of World War II when they kicked Britain out at the evacuation of Dunkirk. And it was happening a lot quicker than what the Allies originally thought would happen. So both Hitler and the Allied generals, the American and British generals, thought, we're advancing a bit too quickly here. We're not sure this is a good thing. And the reason they were worried about it is because obviously Hitler's losing land very quickly, but the Allies were scared that their supply lines and things like that were becoming quite weak, which meant if soldiers aren't getting the correct food or water or even ammunition, they're not going to be as effective, and it's going to end up looking like the Germans will push them back. So they were quite worried about how fast they were moving. And it seemed to Hitler like an easy victory. So he thought Hitler would be able to basically break through this line where these soldiers are particularly weak, and it seemed like a pretty easy victory against a force that was not really fit for battle anymore. So the first thing I would like to do is I would like to draw a mind map with the Battle of the Bulge in the middle of it. And as we discuss the points and go through it, what I would like you to do is make some little detailed notes around your mind map, just so you've got the subject knowledge on what happens at the Battle of the Bulge, because we're then later going to apply that to a historical interpretation. So, choosing to attack the Allied forces at the Ardennes forest in Belgium because it was quiet and relatively weak part of the Allied line, Hitler launched this huge attack on the 16th of December 1944. Now, he basically ordered this massive artillery bombardment on this forest where the American troops were hiding. Then after that had finished, he sent 200,000 troops of his own to attack them with nearly 1,000 tanks. And now the key point is that the Allies, the Americans hiding in this forest, in the Ardennes forest, did not expect this attack and were taken completely by surprise. Now what I'd like to do under your mind map, just answer this little question for me. Why is this an advantage to the Germans? Why is taking the Americans by surprise going to help the Germans? Now many Allied soldiers were quickly overrun by this and had to surrender. However, a few continued to fight around key roads like Saint Vith and Bastogne, and ended up completely surrounded. Now the Germans at this point were winning this battle. Now, as we know, the Americans are not well prepared. If you look at the picture there, you can see it's snowing. They didn't have the right clothing. We've already been over how they didn't have enough food, water, or even ammunition, so they weren't prepared to stop this attack. Now if you look here, you can see on this map what this attack actually does. On the left, the blue section, you've got all the land controlled by the Allies, the Americans and the British. And on the right, you've got all the land controlled by the Nazis. That little indent in the middle where you see the Nazi force pushing in at like a sort of triangle into the Allied area, the Allied land, that is the bulge. That's why it's called the Battle of the Bulge, because it creates this bulge in the land, the map sort of area that happened. Now, the interesting point is that little bit right in the middle. If you see, there is a little dot that says Bastogne with an American flag, completely surrounded by Nazi land. That is because the small American force there was completely surrounded and was fighting on all fronts against the Germans. Now, that little force was the 101st Airborne Division of Paratroopers, which, if you remember from his lesson on D-Day, they're soldiers that parachute into a battle behind enemy lines so to sort of help the main invasion. And in particular, this group of soldiers that was surrounded was known as something called Easy Company, which is a very famous company of soldiers because they are the focus of a TV series that was around in the early 2000s called Band of Brothers, which is very good. When you get a bit older, you get to around the age of 16, I do recommend that you watch it. But they were surrounded for 7 days by the Germans, and for 7 days they managed to hold their own and sort of hold the Germans back. However, despite this time, they experienced extreme cold, intermittent bombardment, which means the Germans sort of bombed them for a bit, left them for a bit, then randomly bombed them again. And all they had for cover were holes called foxholes, which is like little holes that dug into the ground themselves to hide in. Now, these holes weren't often big enough, so if you stood up straight, you like in the trenches of World War I, if you stood up completely, you'd be shot, basically. So you had to crouch down in these holes until an attack came. Now, this dense forest eventually started to cause the Germans a lot of problems, and they soon ran out of fuel for the tanks, and then they lost the momentum in the attack. So the cold, it's basically the weather that defeats them. And the weather cleared. Additionally, when the weather cleared, the American Air Force could continue to bomb the Germans. So the weather first stopped the Germans, then when the weather cleared, before the Germans could start moving again, the Americans were able to send planes over the top of them and drop bombs onto the Germans. By the end of the German Ardennes offensive, which is what it's called, the Ardennes offensive, and the Allied counteroffensive, the Americans had suffered a total of 80,000 casualties, while the Germans sustained 100,000 casualties. So the Germans technically sustained more, the Germans literally sustained more casualties than the Americans. The Ardennes offensive and the American counteroffensive, because the Americans then attacked after the Germans were pushed back, became known as the Battle of the Bulge because of, like I said, the triangular shaped bulge which was created when the Germans initially managed to take the Allied line. And the bulge stretched back through Allied occupied land for miles before the Americans were able to push the Germans back and relieve those soldiers who were surrounded. And aside from D-Day, this was the largest battle in which the Americans fought, and it eventually ended on the 25th of January 1945. Now, what I've got here are 2 videos. The first video is a video I'd like you all to watch. It is a simple history video explaining the Battle of the Bulge a bit more clearly and using some animations to help you understand him. The second clip is a film clip from that TV series I told you about called Band of Brothers. Now, this clip does show the Battle of the Bulge, and it shows the soldiers of Easy Company in that surrounded area fighting against the Germans, and in particular a medic from Easy Company trying to save soldiers and getting them back to the little town of Bastogne that the soldiers managed to hold. I should say before you watch this clip, the content in the Band of Brothers clip is quite violent. It does show real warfare and what it's actually like. It's quite realistic to a certain extent. So if you're the type of person who's disturbed by sort of extreme violence and injuries, don't watch it. Okay, it is just there if you can, if you're okay with things like that. So what we're going to do now is we're now going to look at an interpretation, which we have done lots of during history. And the first thing you should always do when you get an interpretation is to actually read it. So this interpretation is by Sean McConnell in his book The Greatest Events of the Second World War, which is published in 2003. And his interpretation reads, out of all the conflicts of the Second World War, none was more vital in the Allied victory than the Ardennes offensive, which, as we know, is now commonly referred to as the Battle of the Bulge. Here the American forces withstood against an all-out assault from the Wehrmacht, which is the German army, and turned the tide of the battle to achieve a victory that eventually led to Hitler's downfall when the Allies would surround Germany and then Berlin. So the first thing I would like you to do is have a read of that yourself, and then I would like to summarise it in the box that says number 1 in no more than 15 words. What is Sean McConnell saying about the Battle of the Bulge? If you need to pause this video so you've got time to do that, by all means you are welcome to. And number 2, what evidence can you use to support this interpretation? So what have we already discussed this lesson that supports what Sean McConnell has said in this interpretation? Number 3, what evidence can you use to disprove this interpretation? And what I'd like you to do is think back to other battles that we've studied. So you've got the Battle of Stalingrad, D-Day, and if you can bring in any other battle that you might know, what evidence do you know about them that disproves what Sean McConnell is saying? And think, what is he saying? Sean McConnell is basically saying that the Battle of the Bulge is the key battle in World War II. And then number 4, finally, to what extent do you agree with this interpretation and why? So it's been a bit of a short lesson, but the last thing I would like you to do is to draw this continuum for me. So a straight line using a ruler with the labels insignificant conflict or significant conflict on one side. And what I would like to do is thinking about the 3 major battles we've studied over the last few weeks. So we've got Stalingrad, D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. Which one do you think was the most significant victory for the Allies against Nazi Germany? And you're going to draw 3 labels on your line. So you're going to draw 1 label for the Battle of Stalingrad, 1 label for D-Day, and 1 label for the Battle of the Bulge. They can go in any order. This is your opinion, but the most significant one you're going to draw a label towards the right, and the least significant one, if it's less significant, draw a label more towards the left. Okay? And then underneath, in no more than 25 words, I'd like to explain why do you hold this opinion. So why do you think your chosen battle is the most significant victory to the Allies during World War II? Next lesson, we're going to move forward a bit more, and we are going to look at the fall of Berlin, which is a very key event because it sort of ends the war against Nazi Germany.